We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to ChinaTalk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider, here today with Neil Thomas, a research associate at the Paulson Institute's MacroPolo. Today we're going to be talking about how KFC, toilets, and propaganda explain China. So Neil, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
So Neil, what is your favorite Chinese KFC promotion?
It's a very good question because KFC has a lot of promotions. They're very good at their local advertising spend. Probably the most memorable KFC promotion was the first one I saw in China back in maybe around 2012 when I'd first, just started learning Chinese, didn't know anything about the country, and it was a pretty standard promotion. It just started out, there was like a Chinese family, mother, father, a single child with two sets of grandparents. They were all sitting down at a very elaborate, very ornate dining room. I'm thinking this is an advertisement for, some kind of like high-end experience. But then they bust out, a family bucket of 24 KFC fried chicken pizzas. And it's just like, wow, what's going on here? I'm obviously in a very different country. And while I don't remember the, exact name of the promotion or whether it was even very effective, it was just, for me personally, as a student of China, it's just a very eye-opening experience. And it just shows how, even at the very micro level, you can have, huge differences in how goods and companies are received.
So the one that sticks out for me, just in terms of taste, was this recent, French baguette chicken thing, which was really good because the bread was actually super solid. And it's really hard to find, good baguette bread here in China, and all of a sudden KFC was the one to deliver it for me. But my favorite fast food promotion I've come across, and I'm not sure if you're a fan of Rick and Morty, but they had this whole
a big fan
episode about finding Szechuan sauce, which was this mythical sauce that came out when Mulan was released back in 1999 or whatever. And Rick and Morty actually has a following here in China. So McDonald's released this Szechuan sauce, and the whole pitch was all these Americans really love this sauce. And my favorite part about this was the internet's response to this sauce was basically guys, this is supposed to be from Sichuan, but it's not even spicy. It's sweet and goopy. This is so outrageously inauthentic and not good at all. So even the appeal of the nostalgia of this tie-in to this great kush, this sci-fi anime show, it didn't quite land right in China, unfortunately, though I got a big kick out of it, and it was fun bringing back some Sichuan sauce packs to my friends in the US.
There's probably enough foreigners in China to have a bit of a market anyways.
You'd hope. So Neil, when did the first KFC come to China, and what was the scene politically for foreign restaurants and foreign businesses in general at that time?
So the first KFC opened in 1987 on November the 12th at Tiananmen, so just by Tiananmen Square. At the time, it was the very first Western fast food restaurant to open anywhere in mainland China. And politically, in the 1980s, it was the very first decade of reform and opening. So China's future was very contingent. There were different factions in the leadership kind of pushing for more reform or more conservative reform. There's a battle between planners led by Chen Yun and kind of more, market-oriented policies spearheaded by people like Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. So it was definitely a time of economic contestation, but also a time when China was much weaker economically and politically. So it had a much greater need for foreign expertise, foreign brands, and foreign restaurants.
So how did that first KFC go over?
It was a massive hit. There were lines for about 2 or 3 hours outside. And bear in mind, this is November as well, so it was freezing. And the restaurant actually had to call in the local police station to maintain order, because there was so much commotion around trying to get in and trying to be the first person to try those finger-licking good chicken drumsticks. And we actually have some pretty remarkable, really precise statistics for that day. 2,200 buckets of chicken on day number 1 for a cool 83 grand.
Not bad. So I hear it was also booked for weddings.
It was booked for weddings. KFC and Western brands in general were a way for Chinese who were kind of trying to get out of the Maoist era to mark themselves as consumers of a certain class. It was a way to accumulate cultural capital. And one of the other main things about why KFC was successful was that not only did it serve pretty good chicken, it also brought a new type of restaurant experience. So it was very clean, it was very well lit, it was had excellent customer service, and it was probably one of the nicest places where you could hold a function in Beijing at the time, which was still a fairly dour place compared to what it is today.
You know, it's always really interesting to me watching Chinese reality TV or movies where the romantic scenes and the date scenes are always in Western restaurants. Basically, if you want to do something langman, if you want to impress your girlfriend or whatever, you take them to a Western establishment, never to a Chinese food place.
I wouldn't necessarily say never, but especially at the time in the late 80s and early 90s, it really was one of the few places where you could do something like a date, because the older Chinese restaurants were kind of these big banquet-oriented affairs where you'd only very rarely go to them, and it would probably be for some kind of feast, so a wedding or perhaps for a work occasion, perhaps to welcome some foreign visitors who are here to tell you about how you should open a new KFC. So it really was a place to to distinguish yourself and to kind of look towards the future.
What did these KFC operators do from an operational perspective to differentiate them from their competitors?
So I think a key reason why KFC was so successful, because it's now one of the biggest fast food chains in China. It's got about 5,600 odd stores in 1,200 cities, so it's very big. And nowadays it's about $5 billion of revenue coming in each year. So the key to its success was really its ability to build a national supply chain within China. So it expanded quickly and it expanded into cities all over China, whereas McDonald's, for instance, tended to focus first on like the low-hanging fruit. So it opened its first restaurant in 1990, so 3 years after KFC, but it opened not in Beijing, which is the political and cultural capital, but in Shenzhen, just across from Hong Kong, which is, it's a more liberal part of China. It was, where the first special economic zones were, but it was far away from, the center of political attention. So by expanding quickly, KFC could build pretty much an integrated supply chain to the point where about 97% of its inputs were domestic, and only a few years after it entered, where even the salt in 1987 had to be imported because they couldn't find good quality enough salt to make the chicken taste just that much better.
Can you talk me through the chicken wars a little bit? What was going on in the 90s when obviously many Chinese business owners saw that fried chicken was a hit and wanted to create similar restaurants for themselves?
Yeah, so the chicken wars were KFC's first big challenge in the Chinese market. So even by the end of 1988, so the second year that KFC was in China, the Qianmen store in Beijing was its highest selling store anywhere in the world, which is huge for such a well-established fast food brand. So naturally, this success got a lot of domestic entrepreneurs interested in making money off this new sensation of Western fast food and the Western restaurant experience. And they could do that now because there was gradually relaxed rules on economic life and the ability to start businesses. So there was a company called Ronghua Chicken, which started in Shanghai in the early 1990s, which basically copied KFC and made it a little bit more local and had a motto that where there's a KFC, there'll be a Ronghua Chicken. So they basically opened up right opposite KFCs across the country. And their main selling point was that we're Chinese and they're not. And that's a common thing that a lot of Western companies across a lot of different industries have experienced. IP theft, you could call it.
We just recorded a story with we just recorded an episode with Matt Sheehan talking about this dynamic with Google and Baidu, which was a little later than the chicken wars, but certainly something you see very often in competitions between foreign and local brands here in China.
Yeah, so Ronghua was successful for a few years. It was expanding quickly, but by about the year 2000, Ronghua had gone bust. It had folded. it couldn't compete. Not necessarily because it was more expensive. I think it was actually cheaper, but it just didn't have the knowledge of operating systems and supply chains that allowed KFC to be so successful. And there's actually an amazing quote from the boss of Ronghua at the time that it folded, which basically says that, they lacked a well-developed system that KFC possesses to oversee, every aspect of the business: services, site locations, staff training, management. So while it's not quite tech transfer or price competition, this just lack of knowledge of how to run a really complicated business with, supply chains that cross an entire country and maybe cross borders is what allowed KFC to, maintain a pretty dominant position in the market throughout the 1990s. And to win the infamous chicken wars.
It's interesting, there's all this talk of Chinese corporate espionage and stealing plans for planes or whatnot, but you can't really, you can't by nefarious means teach an organization how to run itself and how to do operations. And clearly this is something that Chinese businesses have really mastered with the rise of, Meituan and Ele.me and all this O2O stuff that you see executed in China at a higher level than almost anywhere else in the world. But at this time, there was clearly an edge that KFC and other Western firms had in terms of this brass tacks operational stuff that you need to do to run something like a fast food chain well.
Exactly. And I mean, China is a very complex market to be in, precisely because it is so big. And if you're trying to be a nationwide restaurant chain, operating in, Gansu is not the same as operating in Shanghai. So you really have to be very localized in how you approach that. And while Ronghua was just getting off the ground in the 90s, KFC already had a distribution network nationwide. It had its own cold chain system, its own fleet of trucks, its own, proprietary operations system that, basically enabled it to keep on making money even while it was opening hundreds of new stores all over the country. And so you're totally right. These things like processes, supply chain management, they're difficult. There's a whole, academic discipline of supply chain management. It's hard. You can't just up and do it. And that's the same in even very high-tech sectors like commercial aviation, for instance, where, there's definitely some technical things that China hasn't mastered, but also just putting like a Boeing or an Airbus plane together is a really difficult engineering feat. So that's definitely something that helped KFC in the first couple of decades it was there.
So let's now turn to the 2000s after the Chinese competition caught up. How, in this era, did KFC keep its edge?
Yes, the 2000s were a bit more difficult for KFC because you had a whole bunch of competitors, both from China itself, like Zhen Gongfu, the chain that has Bruce Lee pulling a pose on all of its stores, and also, Japanese chains like Ajisen, which makes some very tasty noodles. They started getting the hang of the China market, and, ultimately running a restaurant business is not quite as complex as, building a Boeing or something like that. So KFC really decided to kind of ditch its Western branding because that had kind of worn off by now. There was a lot of Western companies in China. There's increasing geopolitical tension as well with the US. So it really consciously tried to become a Chinese brand. And so, as you mentioned, like localization of its products was a huge part of that. So, for instance, one of the first things they did was to introduce a Chinese breakfast menu. So you could order congee, soy milk, youtiao, the savory fried dough sticks, and then they also introduced...
Which are some solid youtiao, I must say.
Yeah. Yes, and when they did that, they did it well. They had a very localized management team. Almost all the labor and the management was local or perhaps from Taiwan. So they didn't try to run their China business from New York or Los Angeles. They really did localize the entire China operation. And some of the other great examples of this was the lunch menus. They introduced, just rice meals, basically. And also, they went even more micro in their localization. So beyond just, making the menu Chinese, obviously China is a huge country with a huge variety of different regional tastes and cuisines. And things like the spicy chicken you get at KFC is actually a bit spicier in places like Sichuan and Hunan, where the local cuisine is more chili loving. So they really went the whole hog in making everything local. And they did that as well by granting management in these places a bit more freedom over how they ran their stores.
Could you talk a little bit about how this localization seems to have immunized KFC from politics in a way?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating kind of positive externality for KFC because, as people are probably fairly aware, foreign firms in China have borne the brunt of some nationalist protests when things go bad in geopolitics. So one of the earliest instances of this that KFC encountered was in 1999 when the US bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the NATO bombings of Serbia. And there were massive riots all across China, anti-US riots. And actually in Changsha, 2 KFC outlets were trashed by rioting Chinese because they saw that as the representative of America, it was an American company. And whilst this was true, these protests didn't really spread because in a lot of other places, the local managers and servers were able to argue pretty effectively that KFC was a Chinese company because it had Chinese suppliers, it employed Chinese people, and it really served a Chinese market. So if you were trashing KFCs, you were actually mostly harming Chinese people and Chinese incomes rather than Uncle Sam back in America. So this localization was an effective argument, effective strategy to prevent any further damage or reputational loss through these US-China tensions.
So it was really interesting how some of your sources for this piece, like from the likes of CCTV and Xinhua, were actually seemingly proud of KFC's success, which is certainly not the way they might treat other American brands operating in China.
Yes, that's true. The state media sources, of course, every media is state media to some degree in China. So whilst there is some Xinhua and People's Daily articles, a lot of the sources are more from like the commercial media. So like, Sohu and NetEase, which really do a lot more reporting than just, what's Xi Jinping or the current leader been doing with dignitaries today. They have much more freedom to do things that'll be interesting, that will drive clicks, as long as they don't cross political lines. So a lot of those stories are probably were the meat of this. But I said there are definitely, lessons for other companies that want to do well in the Chinese market. I mean, actually in 2008, KFC adopted a slogan that basically was word for word, change for China. That kind of neatly summarizes their approach. Extreme localization, domestic labor, executives, products, supply chains, advertising. And so that's certainly, like any other market, probably a good strategy to do well in China and a way to localize a lot of the benefits from your business to ensure that there are people in China who are heavily invested in your success. And, politics is alive in China. There is some ability to input into the political system. And if you're doing well and making money for the local economy, even if you're technically an American company, local officials know where their bread is buttered to some extent.
So I had this idea to write a story a little while back doing restaurant reviews of all the domestic Chinese fast food brands. But after eating 2 or 3 of them, I was so disgusted by the food quality that I decided to give up this idea. Do you have any sense of why exactly it seems that Chinese fast food hasn't really caught on? There are no brands as big and successful as the likes of KFC or McDonald's that serve Zhongguo
I'd have to ask you where you went for those first 2 or 3 expeditions, because I think there are actually some pretty decent Chinese fast food chains out there. In fact, my favorite fast food in China is definitely not KFC, actually. It's a place called Shaxian Xiaochi. It's the Pac-Man logo that you might have seen across a lot of cities. It's all over the place, basically. It's from Fujian originally. They do really great zhengjiao dumplings, a good, jitui fan, great fried noodles. and it's super cheap. It's very low end, but it's just quality. It's dependable. It's, one of the first places I went to eat in China. And, it's kind of what I seek it out as like a comfort food every time I go back to China. So there are a few places like that. Granted, I don't eat a lot of the fast food there, but I'd say there are exceptions to what you unfortunately experienced.
Back this summer, I asked for your donations after calculating that the revenue per hour I make making ChinaTalk was around $5 an hour. Thanks to your commitments, there was a little bump, but I basically poured that money into hiring an editor to help me clean up these episodes, and then use the time saves to pump out 2 shows a week in recent months. If you've learned something this year listening to ChinaTalk, and you think this show is worth at least $1 an episode to you, please consider becoming a supporter of ChinaTalk at glow.fm/ChinaTalk. Perks include an exclusive YouTube playlist featuring all the songs that have appeared on the show, and if you commit $150 before 2021, I'll be sure to get you a ChinaTalk mug. So let's now turn to the toilet revolution in China. So first off, I have to ask where you got the idea for this piece in the first place.
That's a great question. The toilet revolution, it started in 2015, and I think I saw some news reports around about that time, and just kind of, thought it was interesting, filed it away. That'd be interesting to do something on that someday. Didn't really grasp the significance of it. I think it just sounded cool, basically, and I thought it'd be interesting to delve in. And then it just kind of, was on the back burner for years and years. Never kind of piqued my interest enough to commit to writing something about it. I just wasn't following it very closely either. And then, when I got to MacroPolo a few months ago, there was just a meeting of the minds, me and some colleagues, and, just decided, I'd just dive in and see what was there and see if it was interesting. And it turns out it is. It's a lot you can glean about contemporary politics and from the toilet revolution.
So, as you say, it is a serious policy platform that enjoys strong backing from the central government and should not be trivialized. So I will do my best not to fall into that trap over the next 20 minutes. So first off, what were the bureaucratic origins of the toilet revolution in the first place?
Yeah, so from my analysis, I think the main driver of the toilet revolution was not Xi Jinping, but actually a current vice minister at the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, a man by the name of Li Jinzhao, who was formerly the head of the National Tourism Administration that got absorbed into the new ministry. So back in the late 90s and early 2000s, he was the mayor of Guilin, which is a very scenic tourist town, which has these old karst mountains that you can, go by on these beautiful rivers. So it's beginning to attract a lot of attention as a tourism destination, both within China and also abroad. So he experienced, unfortunately, the complaints of a lot of foreigners who visited and found the local toilets to be completely unacceptable and definitely much worse than they'd experienced elsewhere. They were mostly pit toilets rather than flush toilets. They really smelled bad. They weren't well maintained. They were dirty, unhygienic. And they didn't even provide toilet paper, which is still a big problem for toilet goers all over China. So he introduced a big push to build a lot of toilets locally, which he called a toilet revolution. And that built, about 850 odd new toilets, which was such a successful policy that central bureaucrats in Beijing noticed what he was doing and declared that Guilin was a model for how localities with tourism destinations should go about constructing new toilets. So this Guilin model became his personal trademark, if you like, within the bureaucracy. So he kept moving through the ranks, and he became head of the National Tourism Administration in 2014. And from there, he started to make toilets a particular priority of that administration. And, they started passing toilet revolution materials. They started to introduce particular conferences and roundtables, discussion sessions on toilets and how to improve toilets in tourism locations. And then they actually launched their own nationwide toilet revolution in February 2015. And Minister Li at that point published a really quite a remarkable essay the next month in March 2015 titled "Tourism Must Develop, Toilets Must Be Revolutionized," where he pretty ferociously attacked local officials who were only focused on GDP growth to the exclusion of public services and clean toilets, obviously. And he identified those substandard toilets as the weakest link in China's tourism infrastructure.
It's really interesting how this all kind of started from being embarrassed at foreigners complaining that they had nowhere to poop. I mean, you would expect that it'd be enough of a motivation to see your own people suffering from these diseases on behalf of poor, on account of something so easily fixable as better sanitation. But no, it actually took folks wanting to hang out at these beautiful karsts and getting frustrated and, writing the equivalent of reviews on TripAdvisor, whatever that was in the 1980s. I don't know, letters to Lonely Planet or something, to get this moving.
So the opinions of foreigners was definitely a key motivating source for local officials in areas with big tourist sites. But there's actually a couple of strands to the toilet reforms that have happened across China over the last 2 or 3 decades. So the toilet revolution actually started and stems from this, tourism toilets push. And it was mainly about building toilets in areas where there's a lot of visitors from abroad, but also from places in China. So obviously people who come from Shanghai have higher expectations for the necessities of life than people who've grown up in rural villages a long way from anywhere. So that was also a factor. But there has been a kind of separate push to subsidize the building of, home toilets, so home flush toilets in rural areas. That's kind of been driven by the state council since the 1980s, basically, when some well-known economists were publishing books calling for a toilet revolution that was not to do specifically with tourists, but as you said, was to do with countering fecal-borne disease like cholera, which obviously is a huge public health issue. There's actually some UN stats that show that $1 spent on more sanitary toilets saves you $9 of public spending on combating diseases like cholera. So that was definitely the motivating force for this other strand of toilet building, which has kind of been happening more in the background since the 1980s. Because even in 1993, it was something like only 7.5% of all rural households had access to a sanitary toilet, which is incredibly low. And that's now up to about 80% today. And they're trying to make that 100% by 2030. So now those two strands, the rural households and the tourism toilets, they've actually been combined in the toilet revolution since November 2017, actually, was when the last time Xi Jinping made some remarks about the toilet revolution. So yes, the opinion of foreigners was critical for tourism.
Backpedaling a little bit, how did this catch Xi's eyes in the first place? And what do you think made him particularly amenable to the toilet revolution?
Yeah, so the toilet revolution kind of became what it is now when Xi Jinping gave his personal seal of approval by making written comments or 批示 on the National Tourism Administration's plans for the toilet revolution. And that was in April 2015. So that's when it became a national level program with the endorsement of the General Secretary, which is obviously very important for getting things done in China's bureaucracy. But in terms of why Xi Jinping himself, as an individual political leader, might have been, particularly disposed to supporting this, amidst the, dozens and hundreds and thousands of other potential policies that are put in front of him, every month. One idea that I had that's in the piece, I can't prove causation, in a double-blind peer review sense, but the propaganda tome that was published to document, Xi Jinping's political origin story, which is called Xi Jinping's 7 Years as a Sent-Down Youth, actually tells a story about how when Xi Jinping was in the little village of Jiaojiahe, he was, as a very young sent-down youth, he was instrumental in building the very first gender-segregated toilets in the village. So he's been doing this for a long time. And then in the 1980s, when he was in Zhengding County as a young party cadre, he also played an instrumental role in making the local toilets cleaner and more hygienic. So he's been mucking around toilets for decades and decades now. And he actually has a bit of a habit when he goes on his rural inspection tours and sits down with carefully screened peasants to tell them about how great he is and how great the party is. He always asks them what type of toilets they have. This is in multiple state media reports of many different visits. And he's very interested in making sure they all have flush toilets. So maybe his personal experiences of living in a place where he had to, the bushes was really instrumental to, a national level policy that he's helped out today.
So, I mean, I totally buy it. Look, when the guy on top has something he wants, and there are a few million people whose whole job it is to implement what he thinks, especially with something that's relatively low cost and, easy to show off when the TV cameras come to count, it makes complete sense that this would filter down. So you write that top-level support generates bottom-up enthusiasm for compliance from ambitious younger cadres vying for attention and hoping to distinguish themselves for promotion. So I don't know how much Ian Kershaw you've read. He's a fantastic historian of the Third Reich, but he has this theory called working towards Hitler, basically where when you have a giant bureaucracy under someone that's in an autocratic system, if it's clear what the top guy wants, you have underlings who are all going to vie for attention in various ways to sort of realize what they think the leader's dreams and aspirations are, so they can come back and give themselves make themselves look good and show that they're, quote, working towards the Führer. So I mean, while this wasn't necessarily doing stuff like, this is definitely a positive impact of that when you have the big boss saying let's build more toilets and people under him trying to work towards that. It's interesting, the sort of parallels in different autocratic systems where you have bureaucracies that are enormous, but all can be sort of oriented towards whatever the top leadership is working on. Maybe sometimes through direct, but also through more indirect channels.
Yeah, that definitely rings true as an approximation of what happens within the Chinese system. Though I'd say that, even aside from communist China and Nazi Germany, similar dynamics play out all across different organizations, whether that's, democratic governments or, organizations, universities, private companies. It's like as a friend once said, the golden rule of upwards management is to make your boss look good. And so that's what happens in a lot of these systems. And it's particularly, I think, has particular power in autocratic systems. I totally agree. You have much more ability to get things done, which is great when, someone like, Minister Li wants to build more toilets to improve hygiene and improve the tourism economy. But obviously when you have more abusive policies, there's also less potential for those to be corrected and modulated within the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think the classic example is Mao and the Great Leap Forward, right? Where you have him deciding on some pretty horrific agricultural policies and everyone under him too scared to tell him it was going poorly or change these horrible rules and regulations around agriculture that led to catastrophe. So yeah, definitely some upsides and downsides when it comes to aggressively top-down bureaucracies. But I'm curious if there are any other, before we get too depressed here, I'm curious if there are any other similarly unheralded but equally important revolutions that you've come across in doing this research.
Yeah, so I think the reason I chose to devote so much time to writing this piece was probably because I thought that the toilet revolution was the most unheralded of all the revolutions that are going on. But in terms of the revolution rhetoric, it's obviously very important within the Chinese system. Currently, the biggest one going on is probably the technological revolution that Xi Jinping is hailing as part of Made in China 2025, plans for self-reliance over the next decade. So that's, kind of a revolution of China's ability to produce indigenous innovation and to produce its own semiconductors and planes and things like that. So that's probably one of the most important so-called revolutions that are happening right now. But I'd say that toilets lays a pretty good claim to being the most unheralded of these revolutions.
So I will note that the technological revolution now has its own 70-episode series. Well, actually, 2 of them recently. So both Aichi and Yoku have released entrepreneurship-type dramas. One, Chuang Ye Shidai, which is the Aichi one, I think, featuring Angela Baby as a high-powered investor going in and out of the startup world with plenty of relationship drama at the same time. So it's funny how you see these sorts of revolutions. The cues are picked up not only in the business world or in the SOE sector, but also in the cultural world, where maybe the casting directors and hotshots at the media companies understand that the government's wanting to push us in a certain direction, so is going to create the next big show, maybe riffing off the theme that the government wants to produce. It's
mind-boggling how they haven't produced a TV series about the toilet revolution yet. I mean, just endless material for toilet humor. I gather that's not really how the Chinese government likes to do things.
So
maybe we can start it. Maybe we can film it. My services as a consultant are available.
Okay, I'll put up a few hundred kwai. Well, maybe we can get a matching grant from the Guilin Tourist Association, documenting their heroic efforts in helping people get private places to go. Number 2. So let's take a quick detour into bicycles. So you recently wrote a piece about the evolution of the role of bicycles in Chinese society. So I like how you start off with an emperor actually enjoying the two-wheeled mode of transportation. So what's the story there?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting story that you just find by when I go do these topics, it's just it's an all spectrum research expedition. Like, I just read everything I can about them. So there are all these amazing stories from Chinese sources about the very early history of the bicycle, which was actually only invented in the early 1860s in Paris and came to China in 1868. So pretty recently in the scheme of things. And they only really took off in China in the early 20th century. They were pretty expensive still. Roads were terrible in China. So it really wasn't a very effective means of getting around. But then you see them start becoming quite popular when, postal services, when armed forces, when police forces start to realize the efficiency dividends of bicycles. And, the roads get better. Bicycle design basically gets to where it is now. And this kind of proliferation of bicycles was not unnoticed in the Forbidden City in Beijing, where the last emperor, Puyi, was still living even after he was deposed, right through to the mid-1920s. And so when he was an adolescent, the story goes that his tutor, Reginald Johnson, who came from England, gave him a bicycle as a present. And he really loved biking. He became a massive fan, and he spent a lot of time basically pedaling around the very empty, forlorn squares of the Forbidden City, in a China that was already post-imperial, where he was basically just, whiling away his time in a kind of purgatory. But anyway, he loved bicycles so much, he actually instructed his staffers to remove a lot of the thresholds in the doors of the Forbidden City. So even today, you can see there's like 30 doors or so that should have thresholds, but don't. And they were all removed in the 1920s when Puyi basically just wanted to ride around a bit more. And he also did things like he turned the very picturesque Pavilion of Crimson Snow, which is a favorite place for meditation and literary contemplation of previous emperors, into a massive bike shed, because he had 20 of the things and he needs to store them somewhere. So that was the place closest to the gate he used to get out, and that's where they went. History be damned.
Some people find bikes very meditative, so it lines up. I think it's okay.
That's true.
So let's now go to the 1980s and 1990s, when China was known as the Kingdom of Bicycles. So what was it about that period that gave bicycles such a toehold as a means of transportation in China?
Yeah, so the 1980s was when incomes started to rise in China for really the first time in a very long time. The economy was growing. People were gradually moving out of the danwei, or the work unit system, whereby you basically live where you worked and get all of your services and food and health education, in that same compound. And we're starting to have commuter lifestyles. And really, because cars at that point were still totally unaffordable, domestic models were few and far between, and public transport as we know it today really didn't exist in a lot of these places. Bus services were meager, and the subways that we probably mostly get around with today, most of those were built in the last 10, 20 years. Beijing had 2 subway lines for most of the reform and opening period. So really the bicycle was the only way to get around. And fortuitously, Mao's government had invested in building up bicycle production capacity. So there are a few million bikes lying around. But once that market got, to some extent, gradually deregulated over the 1980s, production quotas were removed, price controls were removed, bicycle rationing was removed. People could start to access bicycles, and they could start to afford bicycles. And given a lack of any other alternative for all but the CCP elite and people who'd become very rich, which was a very small number of people, everyone used bicycles. So by 1996, you have over 500 million bicycles in China. And the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, all these big cities were just full of bicycles. There were far more bicycles than cars. And you had those kind of white metal barriers that you see today separating off a lot of bike lanes. They were way into the center of the road. So there might be 2 or 3 lanes for cars, but then you'd have 3 or 4 lanes just full of bicycles, of commuters, tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands a day, basically eating up in Beijing, about 70% of the road space was bicycles in the 1980s. So yeah, this kind of absolutely mesmerized, both domestic and foreign observers. But that's really when, around the world, visitors, really latched on to this name, the Kingdom of Bicycles. And it really was for those couple of decades.
Chinese consumers then upgraded to 4 wheels.
Yeah, so in 1994 was the real turning point, if we were to identify one. That was when the National Automotive Industry Policy was passed by the State Council, and the government started to explicitly encourage people to buy cars and explicitly discourage people from continuing to cycle. So that obviously had a huge effect on automobile consumption. China is now, year by year, the largest producer and consumer of automobiles. And, as the 90s and 2000s went on, the bicycle came increasingly to be seen as, a means of transport for the poor and for working class people. And the car rather became a status symbol of urban modernity, where it was one of those things you needed to, make sure you could get married and have a professional reputation. And this was reinforced by government messaging, by economic policy, and also by urban planning. So a lot of the bike lanes that had previously existed were either removed or shrunk significantly. New roads were built that didn't have bike lanes in them. And also people started to move away from the urban centers and into the suburbs as they, started to want to adopt, more Western consumer lifestyles. And there's a whole surge of internal migration from rural areas to the cities as well, which just meant that the cities got bigger and bigger and bigger. And commuting became much more difficult on a bicycle as well, because you just had to travel, 15, 20 kilometers. And now you had a car or maybe a new subway line to do that. So part of it was explicit government policy. Part of it was changing consumer attitudes, which is reinforced by government policy. And part of it was changes in urban geography itself.
Could you talk a little bit about the rise of e-bikes here in China?
Yeah, e-bikes are a really interesting, quite China-specific product, actually. China accounts for about 90% of the global e-bike market. Those are little electronic scooters you see kind of shooting around the streets of Beijing or Shanghai or really anywhere. I used to have one when I lived in Beijing. It was a lot of fun. You could zoom up to 30 kilometers an hour or something crazy. But they became an alternative to bicycles for middle class, working class people because they were much cheaper than cars. They were also much faster and less effort than bicycles. And they also had an advantage over, say, motorcycles, which were heavily regulated in most major cities because of the noise and the pollution that they created. So they're definitely still a competitor for bicycles, but there's not really any international impact from e-bikes. There are some people in the US who are trying to, really make them happen here, but that hasn't really taken off just yet. So it's mostly still a China-specific product.
So recently, it seems like we've actually had a bit of a resurgence in bikes here in China.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the bike-sharing craze that swept China from about 2016 onwards. There's since been somewhat of a correction, as a lot of the smaller firms have gone bust. So now you can go to Chinese cities and download an app, pay a deposit, and then you have access to this whole fleet of thousands, hundreds of thousands of bicycles that are just lying around that you can find on GPS, pay a small deposit, small fee, and then ride around to anywhere you're going. And then you can just leave them there. So it's super convenient, and it really solves a lot of last mile problems that people have for point-to-point commuting or leisure or what have you. So these, were sort of enormous hype when they first came out, and companies like Ofo and Moorbike, raised billions of dollars and started expanding incredibly quickly. So there are about 20 million bikes they ordered in 2017, which have been strewn across China's cities, much to the consternation now of many local authorities, because user growth was very quick, and basically everyone who wanted to get on board joined immediately. So that was about 500% year-on-year growth. Moorbike hit about almost 40 million monthly users. But then there was a big correction as, there was kind of negative externalities of just having too many of these bikes. And they got broken, they got hard to find, they got stolen, they just got in the way of people's lives. So cities started putting caps on them. So people started, not using them because there's too much effort. And now, even an industry leader like Moorbike has about 20 million monthly users. So the market's stabilizing, it's corrected, and it will probably remain a presence in big Chinese cities. But the hype, I think, is definitely over.
Yeah, I mean, it really does change the way you navigate a city and just gives you this extra kind of radius with which you can really comfortably get around in a 10-15 minute bike riding experience. But at the same time, I do find it a little bit sad to watch these companies sort of crumble and shrivel up a little bit from these massive, massive dreams they had in the spring and summer and fall of 2017. So now turning to Chinese propaganda. So what exactly has changed from the Xi era to prior years of CCP trying to get its message out there?
Sure. Yeah, I think propaganda is a really fascinating part of the Chinese political system. It's so different from how politics works in Western democracies. Obviously, there's political messaging, which is similar, but its role is extremely important for the party in a way that's kind of unique to autocratic systems. So, actually, my colleague Damien Ma and I wrote a piece about propaganda a couple of months ago now, and we dubbed Xi Jinping's approach to propaganda propaganda in the new era, appropriating one of his key themes after the last party congress. So we identified 4 kind of new things about propaganda in the Xi Jinping era that constitute this propaganda in the new era, or propaganda 2.0, you might put it. So the first of those is that there's been an increasing amount of control by the party rather than the state over propaganda. And we saw that particularly at the reorganization of the state and party ministries in March 2018. So the old, clunkily named State Administration of Press, Publication, Radio, Film, and Television was broken up, and the party gained control over press, publication, and film. So that was pretty big because the party hasn't controlled press and publication since the 1980s, and it hasn't controlled film since 1949. And this is important because whilst obviously the party basically controls the state in China, it's a one-party state, there is a not insignificant administrative difference because they are formally separate administrative entities. The party exercises control through party committees in state organs and also through party discipline mechanisms that it has over all party members who, basically everyone in the higher reaches of the state is a party member, so they can't disobey party orders. So it's pretty effective control, but there is room there for, bureaucratic backsliding, for administrative delays, for, the advancing of parochial priorities that might not exactly align with party directives. So it is a significant shift. So less is likely to get through to the keeper than previously. So things like Chai Jing's documentary, Under the Dome, maybe now that's not going to ever see the light of day, whereas it had a few days before it was censored previously. So that's the first major change. The second major change is we actually managed to find some data on propaganda budgets, and we've detected a pretty big increase in funding, particularly over the last year, since Xi really cracked down on his control over the system, for instance, by removing term limits, and through his kind of triumphant 19th Party Congress last year. And to our knowledge, we found some data that no one else has used before, because Shanghai is one of the more liberal cities in China, and it prides itself on running a very tight ship in its municipal government, and it has a kind of gold standard freedom of information regime. So it actually publishes budgets for its propaganda department, which is amazing because it's really hard to find any data on any other propaganda anywhere else in the country. For instance, because no party organ is obligated to disclose its propaganda budget or any of its budgets. So yeah, we saw a big 40% jump from 2017 to 2018, from about 360 million to 560 million US dollars. And we have some kind of less verifiable data that there's been significant increases in the central propaganda budget, hundreds of percent increases over Xi Jinping's short reign. But basically, we can assemble enough data, also from the ministry, also from Xinhua, that there has been an increase in propaganda budgets beyond, simple year-to-year growth that you'd expect. There's also been, possibly one of the most interesting and most visible parts of the new propaganda is the improved quality of its content. Obviously, it's still not quite Wolf Warrior 2, which is the very entertaining patriotic film that, broke box office records a year or two ago. But, documentaries like Amazing China, new internet features like the infographics that accompany new policies have really improved the content delivery of party messages. It's still propaganda, but it's packaged in a way that is much more conscious of consumer tastes, is much more conscious of the need to be liked by people, the need to be entertaining, the need to actually be interesting, to capture people's attention and to then convey the party's message to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how right now there is so much more competition, right? In the 60s and 70s, there were literally no books you could read besides like Marx and Engels and Mao and a few other approved novels all extolling communist virtues. But nowadays, kids can just go watch Marvel movies on iQIYI. Like there's nothing stopping. There's much more fighting for people's attention. So it sort of makes sense in a way that the government does recognize that it needs to up its game to get its message across.
Absolutely. And one of the key motivators for doing propaganda work better, it's a really existential thing for the party, because the party is obviously obsessed with staying in power. like you'd expect any political regime to be. And its main kind of negative lesson that it studies is obviously the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And Xi Jinping's actually, on record telling Central Committee study sessions that, we have to learn from our predecessors. And the reason that the Soviet Union collapsed, or one of them, in his opinion, is that the ideological control broke down after, Gorbachev introduced his reforms that basically allowed for a free media for a time. And before him, Khrushchev denounced Stalin in the secret speech. And this kind of breakdown of the ideological infrastructure of the regime is seen to be, potentially fatal to the faith that people have in it to improve their lives, and the sense that there are, no alternatives to the party's control of the country and the state. So, yeah, it's incredibly important. And this content improvement is, basically the party trying to adapt to, the internet environment, to adapt to changing consumer trends, the way that a private company might for its own advertising, to, make its message more effective.
Yeah, I do find it really funny, because there's all these articles, or maybe a few years back now, about how brands need to tell a story and to create a narrative around their product, which is, exactly what Xi is trying to do right now with the Communist Party. Supposedly something that should be above capitalist bourgeois concerns, but is really taking a page out of the Madison Avenue advertisers' playbook, it seems.
Absolutely. All, This American Life or podcasts like that. Storytelling is very en vogue in the West, and the Chinese government does use Western consulting firms and PR firms to help it craft its messages. And yeah, it's definitely not lost on Xi Jinping.
So Neil, you teased this fourth major change, and we can't let you go without hearing what else is going on in Chinese propaganda.
I know you're hanging on my every word, so I'll make it quick. So the fourth part of propaganda in the new era is that we've seen it to probably have worked, at least to some extent. There's a few public opinion measures that show that the effectiveness of propaganda in raising levels of public trust in China's government has risen. So we put together basically all the public opinion data we could find, because there's not a lot that specifically addresses trust in the government. There is some. One of the ones we found was an Edelman data set. That's an American PR firm. And so their 2018 Trust Barometer showed that China actually topped a 28 market ranking of public trust in institutions. So China had about 84% of the general public said that they trusted the Chinese government. And 68% said that they thought that government, as opposed to business or media or NGOs, was the institution in society most likely to lead to a better future. In the same year, there's obviously some issues with cross-country comparison, but in the same year, America's general trust level in the government has fallen to about 36%, which is obviously very worrying for America, but much lower than the Chinese number.
So if Trump wants to raise his approval ratings, it's not decrying fake media as fake media. It's what he really should be doing is creating his own fake media and making it, spew, puff pieces left and right is really what you're getting at.
Perhaps. Xi Jinping definitely focuses on a positive energy is what he wants, diffusing all of China's propaganda. Though Trump has seemed to do very well off the opposite, negative energy, particularly aimed against, all of his imagined enemies of America. Maybe the countries really are, opposites in that regard. But, more American flags and waving cornfields surely can only do good, right?
For sure. So now feels like as good a time to shout out as ever. Da Hufa, which is a Chinese animated movie that came out in the summer of 2017. I'm not sure if you've come across this, but it is far and away the most kind of aggressively counter-government piece of media that I've seen released in China. And it's funny reading the Douban, which is like the, Metacritic comments for it, where everyone's sort of shocked that this was able to get a wide release in China, because the theme is basically of this, warrior or peanut who sort of goes around and tries to liberate people from this brainwashed state of mind. So even today in China, some things end up getting through the goalpost. It's just the vast majority of the stuff is certainly on message. I'm curious if there's anything that really strikes out for you as interesting contemporary media that kind of goes against this, that you've seen come out of the mainland.
Well, I think over the Xi Jinping era, the trend has definitely been towards tightening the ideological sphere. You have the document number 9 that came out in 2013 that had, the 7 no's, which were basically all of the values of Western liberal societies and media freedom. There are obviously still a lot of interesting things that happen in China. There was obviously recently an essay by a scholar, Xu Zhangrun, that was excoriated the party, that was published on the Unirule website. I'm not sure what the status of its censorship was, but it was definitely live for a while, and things have got through. There was I think an article on a Xinjiang government website 2 or 3 years ago that was critical of the party. There's been articles on the Central Disciplinary Commission website that have, kind of used history to historical analogies to make veiled warnings that the system needs more voices in the policymaking process rather than just Chen and Xi. Yeah, I mean, there's still some interesting things happening, like websites like The Paper, like Jiemian. They occasionally publish stories that, they're definitely within the bounds of political expression. Nothing on like Tibet or the Uyghur situation is getting through in official media in the mainland, but there's still definitely interesting things that get published. Sixth Tone, the English partner of The Paper, publishes some interesting articles on Chinese society that are definitely not always flattering, and some of them are very good. Some of them are basically investigative journalism. So the media is not totally dead, but there is definitely less and less space for interesting things to get through. Also, MacroPolo is not blocked yet.
It's true. Neil, thanks so much for coming on China Econ.
Thanks for having me.
天轮到我要跟你呛，人们总在讨论我们谁比谁的更香。其实说实话，就真的没有什么好讨论的。当然，全球里的业绩就比你强上好几轮了。哎呦，我的鸡翅炸到比你脆，薯条的味道只有我们才是对。这世界上没人能抵挡我的香味，我的汉堡各种各样，让你馋得流口水。 我只想让你认清，我才是人们最喜欢的。你敢说童年生日从没在我这里过的？单论智力，我就比你还高上足足3年。就长相而言，你们还得叫我一声爷爷。我是全球最受欢迎的炸鸡连锁店，而你只是我的影子，这没办法改变。啊哈，怎么办？你只能够生气，只好化成一个小丑掩盖你悲伤情绪。你吃炸鸡，炸鸡，炸鸡，还是吃个汉堡？你会买的哪个给你公司领导？你吃炸鸡，炸鸡，炸鸡，还是吃个汉堡？到底谁才是怪？ 我認同你哋炸雞，其實我都好中意。不過我哋啲炸雞先係最強嘅始終字，口感絕對 No.1， 體驗感就 very fun。麥辣雞腿堡係招牌口味，勁過張一山。我從來不會過時，我從來不缺創意。我哋絕之魚尾雞係最成功嘅經典。我保證你間店對面絕對有我店鋪，我自己有自己一套，你喺對面睇過點數。吃炸雞，炸雞，炸雞，還是吃個漢堡？你會買的哪個給你公司領導？你吃炸雞，炸雞，炸雞，還是吃個漢堡？到底誰才是怪這裡的王道 ？Here's a little story that must be told. You sell a lot of chicken, but that chicken is old. 11 herbs and spices, but you don't even like it. Don't believe me, guys? Hey, Colonel, go ahead and bite it. I'm the real OG when it comes to fast food. You trying to beef? I'll just fry it in grease, fool. Somebody come and sit this old man down. I'm loving it. Now go back to your town. Me an old man, hey son, you must be joking. Yeah, we got beef because of me now we're smoking. You following my footsteps cause my chicken's so good. But yours is just squeezed, mine's a finger licking good. But fool, you must be tripping, gone in the head. To think you won this battle, I'ma put bozo to bed. I'm real OG, let's get that straight, cloud. Here's your ticket back, you gon' lose
Oh, my in-laws just called to let us know they're on their way over, and we're out of food. Great. Luckily, Instacart helps me get groceries delivered in as fast as an hour. Plenty of time to cook an in-law-worthy meal. Now, what to make? Chicken parm. Perfect. Download the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get free delivery on your first order using the code PREPARED22. Now the only thing to worry about is dinner conversation. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $10. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.